Welcome back to Baltimore Birdwatchers. My name is Nikhil Mehta. With me, as always, is Daniel Rotter. Our schedules have conflicted for a little bit, but we are really excited to be back with you. Uh, Daniel, the Orioles have fired Brandon High since we last did our last episode. Tony Mansolino was the manager. Your initial thoughts on his first 21 games in charge?
Well, I mean, he certainly didn't inspire a lot of confidence with his pressers when he first took over, basically saying, "I'm new to this. I've never done this before. I don't know what I'm doing." The team results have been much better than they were under Hyde. How much of that is short sample size versus actual, real tweaks? I'm not 100% sure, right? Especially considering the pitching has been suddenly amazing lately. So that certainly helped Mansolino's case look a lot more like colorful and flowery. Yay, Tony Mansolino, he's the guy. I mean, I don't think he's the guy for the future, but the theme of the episode today is let's get weird, and by having Tony Mansolino, we're getting weird already.
Yeah, I think, I'm glad you introduced that, Daniel, because it's something that you mentioned before we hit record here about, when you have a season like this, Mansolino is the interim, and they've pretty much determined he's going to be the interim for the rest of the season. That very much screams that the Orioles have accepted the fact that they're not going to be contending for the playoffs. And when that's the case, when you have a roster that was ostensibly built for the playoffs, I think getting weird is the way to go. And I'm not saying you don't do anything crazy, but I think you try different things, you try to develop different players. We're going to talk about some of that today. As far as Mansolino goes, the run differential is way down, minus 1.7 runs per game under Hyde, minus 0.67 under Mansolino. The run differential is still negative despite winning 11, having an 11 and 10 record under him. A lot of that is just small sample size, largely inconclusive, though it is clear that the team got the message somewhat in terms of turning things around after Hyde being fired. Mansolino, it just seems like he wasn't even aware he was about to become manager until he became manager. It doesn't reflect great on the organization that he seems so unprepared. I kind of respect his willingness to admit that and acknowledge that, hey, I've never done this before. And I think you said before we record that you don't think you'd ever heard a manager say that he has not done this before as many times as Tony Mansolino has in the last 3 weeks. It feels like he's gotten his arms around the job now. Obviously, their record in the last, I think it's 9 games, they're 7-9. Helps and makes you feel better about the team, although it's worth noting that three of those were against the White Sox. So yeah, I mean, Mansolino, my thing with Mansolino is that he is neither the kind of older sage wisdom manager, nor is he the younger, I have a lot of energy. And I think either way, maybe he's a steady hand on the rudder, but he's certainly not stepping on the accelerator to get this team moving that much better than they are right now. And I think that they certainly needed the push from Hyde, but I don't know what push is going to take them to the end of the season. Um, the idea of let's get weird, I think, is when you're in this position, when you know you're not going to make the playoffs, you have to kind of reorient what your goals are for the rest of the year, both as a team and for individual players. Before we go into those, I just wanted to run through where the roster is right now. On
Can
the
I add
IL,
something real quick about Let's Get Weird that I
yeah.
just thought of?
Mhm.
This is something I never saw under Brandon Hyde. The play that Ryan Mountcastle messed up his hamstring, where O'Hearn got into the pickle between first and second to get Mountcastle home to manufacture that run. I was like, yes, dude, I feel like we never saw those creative kind of risky maneuvers under Hyde or very rarely. So I was so excited to watch that. I was like, let's go. We're gonna kind of do a little trickery here with a an inexperienced team in the White Sox manufacture a run. That was a little bit of weirdness that I could get behind from Tony Mansolino, even though I have, very little belief that he will be with the club following October, whatever, first week of October this season.
Yeah, but I think that general feeling of playing a little bit looser, relaxing, the pressure's off, which is I think especially important for some of the younger guys that are going to be getting at bats and maybe getting some starts later this year. They're not jumping into a playoff contender like so many of the other guys have when they've been called up over the past few years. And that means you can I mean, one, there are some positional questions about a number of Orioles players, whether it's Mayo's spot in the infield, seems like it's likely first base, but you could try him at third base. And the downside is he makes a couple errors. Maybe you lose a game, but that just doesn't really matter at this point. So you can afford to get a little bit weirder there. Before we get into all of the weirdness we want to see the rest of the year, a quick look at the roster, just because it's been a while. Remaining on IL, starting pitching is still the weakness of this roster construction. Grayson Rodriguez, Kyle Bradish, Tyler Wells, Albert Suarez all remain on the injured list. Mountcastle, you mentioned his injury. He's going to be out for a little bit longer. Tyler O'Neill and Gary Sanchez are on AAA rehab assignments. The Orioles thankfully have both of their center fielders back in Colton Cowser and Cedric Mullins. And the big one, and the guy who maybe can bring the weird a little bit is Westberg himself, who is Jordan Westberg, who to me is the straw that stirs the drink of these offense. I think Mansolino called him, the glue guy that holds everything together. Loves to keep rallies going by finding the gaps. Plays really hard. Just does a lot of things that can help inspire his teammates and maybe get a little bit more out of them. The Orioles sent Heston Kjerstad down to AAA. Um, just not hitting. And when the defense is as bad as it was, and you're not even showing development at the plate, there's just no place for you in the major leagues. I'm not sure it's really that much more complicated than that. Mansolino said that, the Orioles have a plan, which not only do they have a plan, it seems that Mansolino is aware of the plan, which is an improvement on the start of his tenure as a manager, where he very much seemed to be thrown in the deep end without any preparation. What are your thoughts on Kjerstad at this point and his potential moving forward? One thing I will add that we talked about before I hit record as well is his value might have been higher last trade deadline, and that they maybe should have traded him and been more aggressive in trying to move him when he was all potential, because it just doesn't he hasn't been able to tap into any of that potential this season.
I think, by sending down Kjerstad, we maybe did make our team a little less weird, right? Heston Kjerstad was kind of a very unconventional looking player, and whether that is based on like, bad amount of, luck or poor coordination, like we talked about, um, is up in the air. I mean, he certainly has a very unconventional batting stance that was not leading to a whole lot of success this year. The big thing for me was the approach. Never really looked like it changed. He was constantly fishing for breaking balls in the dirt, even when he had count leverage. So that led to a lot of strikeouts and a lot of uncompetitive at bats. In the outfield, he's graded out as the worst outfield defender so far this year by outs above average, and he hasn't even started every game or anything. You could see it with the eye test too. There's a lot of balls that we've watched off the bat where Kjerstad tries to run him down, he can't get him, and you think to yourself, well, this is something that most corner outfielders probably should have gotten to. So, look, there's got to be some kind of plan to make him into a more valuable major league player than he was up to this point, because we thought the bat was going to be what was going to keep him here. And frankly, the execution has not been there, right? We've heard about the raw power, the game power. We've heard about that in AAA. He's performed there. Now he's got to take what he's learned, and this is probably the last kind of tweak in his game that he's going to get in AAA before it's like, okay, you need to put up or shut up in the major leagues now, right? You're 26. So he's going to get his time there, refine his approach, and hopefully he can come back and be an impactful hitter, because it's hard to see. I mean, look, the guy's build is not an unathletic build, right? He's not overweight. He's not weirdly proportioned. Like
He's sneaky fast. He's not a slow
yeah,
guy.
he's an athletic player. So there's also no reason why he has to be the worst outfield defender either. But I do think, that value is going to come from the bat. And so hopefully the plan is working on play discipline, execution with, you know, two strikes and picking up breaking balls out of the hand. I guess that's what you got to work on with him.
Yeah, and I think, the rest of the season for him, I imagine maybe like when rosters expand, this feels like it could be a longer stint down in AAA as he works on these things. It's not, we've seen some short stints in AAA for some prospects after they've gotten called up. This one feels like it's going to be a longer one. Purely conjecture. But based on the struggles and the clear need for some not small adjustments, I think that this could be a longer stretch. I think he might come up again by the end of the year, especially if the Orioles deal guys at the deadline. And the goal for him would be get back to the major leagues, and like you were saying, proof of concept. Are you going to be able to do this or not? And I think you're not going to know that for sure by this year for Kirst by the end of the year for Kirstad, but you'll know which direction the arrow is pointing, and that's going to give you a really strong indication of his future. Any other particular notes on the current roster, recent moves that you want to get into before we talk about the Orioles' goals for the rest of the season?
Well, I was a little surprised when we ended up sending Heston Kjerstad down just because I see Dylan Carlson as a replacement level player, honestly. I mean, I know he's run into a couple home runs, but he was DFA'd multiple times already in the major leagues. So I kind of thought, well, if we're going to hold on to someone, maybe it should be Kjerstad, keep him around the big league coaching staff, but it does also make sense to make sure he's playing every day in the outfield, especially when he has frankly sucked there. And then Carlson is also a guy that you can bring in just as a defensive replacement late in the game. Although I don't know if we'll really need that a ton, maybe if O'Hearn's out there. But we got Kowser back, we got Mullins back, so the outfield defense should be a bit better. And Laureano is a good defender too, who has, to his credit, played great. He's definitely earned more of a bigger role on this team, and maybe could be a sneaky trade candidate, which we'll get into in another episode. But yeah, I mean, as far as the roster goes, like we're getting healthy finally offensively. And as a team that saw this tweet statistically, the worst offensive team against left-handed pitching by OPS since 1979. So hopefully by getting healthy, getting everyone back, we're introducing Kobe Mayo into this offense as a regular player now, a right-hander. We're getting Jordan Westberg back, another right-hander who hits a lot of line drives. Hopefully we're seeing Adley Rutschman, Gunnar Henderson start to turn a bit more of a corner. They both underperformed based on expectations. So I mean, just want to see more production from the offense in a team that has over this winning streak largely been carried by pitching that's been better than their true talent.
Yeah, I think that's the big thing is that this pitching will not hold for the duration of the season, especially if they do move some of their starters and or relievers by the trade deadline. We are really excited for our trade deadline that's going to be coming up soon. I think a lot of potential deals that Daniel has constructed that the Orioles could look into. That'll be coming in a couple of weeks. For right now, I want to focus on what the goals are for the rest of the season. And to me, they kind of fall into two categories. One is kind of more realistic, traditional goals, like 500 baseball is probably an upper percentile outcome for the 2025 Orioles at this point, but I think is a realistic sight to set your eyes on and say, okay, what do we have to do to get to this point? I think, like you said, it would certainly be the bats living up to their potential and the starting pitching managing to stay at the pace that they've been under Mansolino and maybe not regress too badly to their peripherals, especially if Sagano and Eflin could both be gone after the deadline. And so that'll make things real tough in August and September when those are the two best pitchers the team has had this year. And now their rotation, I don't want to imagine what it would look like without those two guys. What do you think would have to go right for this team to hit 500 ball this year?
A lot, man, a lot, because I don't have a lot of faith in how this team is currently constructed. I do think the offense should hopefully get better with a good bill of health because almost every regular on the offense has been injured at some point this season. I mean, if it weren't for our godsend Ryan O'Hearn keeping, one stable bat throughout the entire year in the lineup, who knows what this team's record would be. But now that it seems like we have a player that we view as pretty much an everyday player playing every position now. Let's see that upper echelon offense start to assert itself a bit more. And that is going to have to really buoy this team if they have aspirations to get back to a winning record for sure, because this pitching staff is nothing you can bank on, especially when, like you said, their two biggest names or most consistent contributors are likely out the door at the end of July. So, I mean, we're just gonna have to see everything get better than it has, if that's a really oversimplified thing to say, because we're 11 games under 500, 12 games under 500 at the time of this recording.
Yeah, I mean, I think and like I said earlier, there's realistic goals and then there's the weird goals. So I want to go through the realistic goals first before we get weird. I think one thing I have in mind is definitely wanting to see Adley Rutschman maintain his recent pace. his fall off this year has been maddening at times, inexplicable almost at others with the peripherals. But at a certain point, once the sample size hits a certain level, the peripherals matter less than the fact that he's just not quite producing at the plate. The power hasn't quite been there. I'm a little more encouraged by the approach. I think we saw, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, a journalist, can't remember which one, point out that Adley was toe tapping in his swing. He stopped doing that, started hitting better. And I know these things aren't one for one cause and effect, but it is a little frustrating to see something like that get publicly identified before the team figures out that they need to address it internally. So I want to see him maintain this pace. I don't really have an end of season stat line in mind for him because he started so poorly. It's just I don't know what a realistic goal to set for him would be, but I want to see him maintain this pace and prove that he belongs in the top of the lineup and in the heart of the order where he has been for most of his career. But this last recently, he's gotten moved out of it a little bit just because he hasn't been performing. In terms of pitching, I think traditional goals, I think it's just a matter of maintaining what we've seen in the past few weeks. Pitching to me is, I think, where the desire to get weird gets a little stronger. Other bats, I'm not really sure what big expectations I have for the other bats in this lineup. Obviously want to see O'Hearn continue to succeed. But I think the point is that realistically, in the traditional sense of goal setting, there's not a lot that this 2025 Orioles team can accomplish. And I think that's why it's important to kind of create some alternate goals and figure out what you can do to make this season feel like a success, even if it isn't with your record and your statistics.
Yeah, offensively, as far as goal setting goes, we need to see a core group of guys really assert themselves for next year, right? We have this perceived core of young players. I think you could say Gunnar, Adley, Cowser, Westberg, Jackson Holiday, they're the perceived offensive core of the team. And then, maybe we could talk into some of the younger guys potentially joining that core as well. But look, I mean, of all of those players, only one of them has even met their preseason expectations. And, I'm willing to admit that injuries played a role in that as well. But Jackson Holiday has been a very serviceable major league player, which has been fantastic. But we've seen Adley, despite somewhat promising underlying metrics, right? He's always had that strong approach, not walking a good amount, not striking out too much. I'd like to see him, like he said, he challenged himself, I think, to hit more doubles, get that gap to gap power back, maybe try not to roll over too many things. Hopefully simplifying his stride and load at the plate will help him get his timing down better. I mean, Gunnar has been disappointing. The thing with him has been he is hitting the ball in the air much more infrequently than we've seen from him in the past. And this is a guy that if we're going to win a World Series, we're banking on him to be the team MVP. And he only has a mid 700s OPS right now, which, like, compared to Major League average, he's still a good hitter. He's not an MVP candidate yet, so I'd like to see that improve. And then I said to you earlier, I think it would be really promising to see two of Adley, Cowser, and Westberg hit for a 775 OPS or better, because we can say, okay, we have a guy that we hope is a MVP candidate. We have multiple above average, definitely above average major league hitters. If one of them kind of flounders, they still could get better in 26. We have a good feeling that Jackson Holiday is going to build off a strong age 21 season and keep going. And then we can talk about the Kobe Mayos, the Sam Basayos when we get into next year. Maybe Heston Kjerstad figures it out too, and we go from there. But we need this offensive core to play like the offensive core of a winning team for next year.
Yeah, so I like all of that. Honestly, don't really even have much to add. Other than I guess with Holiday, I think I've been very encouraged by his continued adjustments at the plate. I want him to keep trending in the right direction. With Gunner, I think missing the ramp up period is tough. But now we're getting to the point, kind of like we got to with Adley before he started to turn around, that the ramp up period is long enough ago now. You've been struggling for long enough that something needs to improve, and that you want to see those improvements. I haven't seen anything out of Rushman in the last 2 weeks. This is the way I have out of Adley that tells me that this is the pivot point and that he's on his way up. And if he's, like you said, going to be that guy, right? Him and Adley are supposed to be the guys. And Adley is trying to get back to being that. Gunnar has not been that yet this year. And that has an effect on the whole team. I think it's a sense of, leadership. They're the guys who have been up the longest from this bunch of bats that the Orioles have drafted over the last half decade. And I think that it's really, really more than a half decade. But I think it's really, really important for those two guys in particular to get up to the level that they're expected to be at. Westberg and Cowser are two guys that I really feel this like Westberg, like I said, straw that stirs the drink. I really have felt that Cowser could be a similar guy with his approach. The injuries have been a problem. Please don't slide into first base anymore. But I think that him maybe not hitting quite Westberg's level of production because Westberg has been really good, but trending in that direction would be what I'm looking for him. But we've been dancing around this, we've been mentioning it. Let's get weird. I want to think about the things that this team can do that's just a little bit different this year. I want to start with Kobe Mayo. To me, this seems like the prime opportunity to get him up with Mountcastle on the injured list. I think you mentioned before we hit record that Emmanuel Rivera's DFA'd, and that should clear the path for Mayo to get up. But to me, and I mentioned this earlier, all of these prospects have come up other really than Adley and maybe Gunnar. Everyone else has come up in a period where the Orioles are expected to win games. They're either in the middle of trying to be a playoff contender or they're expected to be one throughout that season. And it has put a lot of pressure on these young batters to come in and produce right away. And I think that having Mayo up right now, when I'm not saying that these games don't matter, but I think that the individual development of all these players matters a little bit more than the win-loss record at the end of the season at this point. Mayo getting that development right now could be really crucial for his ability to hit the ground running in 26. I also think there's a defensive factor to it too, where we're not fully sure that he can't be a third baseman in the major leagues. We probably don't think he's going to be, but again, you have the opportunity to try it out. And if he flounders at third base and it becomes clear that he can't do it, then he plays first base. But doing that this year, there's really not that much to lose. So you have the opportunity to maybe try him out at third base more than you would have if this was a contending year, and maybe see if you can get lucky and he can adjust himself and get settled at that spot in the major league. So he's not a first baseman only. That would kind of be my let's get weird with Mayo. What are some other things you want to see happen that are maybe a little bit on the unorthodox side?
Well, like you were saying with Mayo, it has been a bit odd how he has just not been given a runway when he's come up to the big leagues. And even when he was brought up just now, he was still having, playing time being taken away from him from a guy like Emmanuel Rivera, who was DFA'd by the Marlins last year. So, it was nice to see the Orioles move on from him, even though he was a decent defender. Okay, he's not a part of the team's future, so now we can really kind of land the plane. Let's get Kobe Mayo every day at bats here and see what he's made of because we know that he's been hyped to have great raw power. Hopefully, with more reps, he can kind of find his routine and get to being a productive major league hitter because I mean he expressed a lot of discontent for not making the opening day roster saying, well, what else can I do? And I think you saw that manifest itself in AAA because when he went back down, honestly, he was not as good as he was this past year. And I'm sure it was almost more of a mental hurdle than anything. Like, what can I even do to stake my claim to this roster? And, unfortunately it had to be an injury to another player, but now he's going to get a real chance. And so hopefully, he's able to get the reps that he needs to establish himself as a cornerstone at first. I'm a little less like thinking that he needs to play third just because I do think the infield is pretty set at the moment. Obviously, he could be like a fill in for an injury or something, but seems like Jordan Westbrook's going to play third, even though he doesn't have an outstanding arm. I think he'll probably be able to hold it down at least for the next, few years or something. So, yeah, it's definitely good to see that Kobe Mayo is going to play. And then as far as getting weird, I'm ready to switch things up with the pitching staff. I mean, I know that look, the pitching has been pretty solid lately, right? They've been the reason that we're winning games. So I can't necessarily say a lot of bad things about their recent production, but they still aren't forecasting to be good pitchers down the road. I think that they were pitching a little in over their heads lately, to be quite honest. And part of that might be due to finally we've made coaching staff adjustments. Finally our pitchers aren't getting absolutely shelled every time they go out there. But we've mentioned that Eflin could be gone. Sugano could be gone at the trade deadline. And we don't think this team is going to get to 500. And we have an interim manager. Let's try out a bunch of guys and let's see who could establish themselves as a potential face on the major league roster for next year. Whether that's new young pitchers we bring in, whether that's Chase McDermott, Brandon Young. We've got good arms ascending. I know that they're probably still a little bit farther off, like Braxton Bragg and Nestor Herman, but I'm not expecting them necessarily to get called up. But Trevor Rogers, we need to try everybody in the second half. Let's get unconventional, um, and let's see who can assert themselves as a guy who needs to stay on this roster before we go into an off season that's insanely crucial for Mike Elias's job, right? I know a lot of people want him gone now. I don't necessarily want him gone now. I think what he's done so far is making me willing to keep him around for another year. But I think if we're still sitting here talking about this in June of 2026, I'm going to start to change my mind. So it would be really nice to just get a little more clarity on a pitching staff that feels incredibly unclear.
Yeah. I think you mentioned Rogers. That's the big one for me. The oft maligned Stowers and Norby trade. I think that's gotten a little bit blown out of proportion, but the reason that people are able to do that is because Rogers hasn't shown anything in the majors yet. I don't remember how many years he's still under contract for. I think we have him for next year for 26 as well. And that means that if he's going to be a member of the rotation, you don't want 26 to be his first significant starts as an Oriole. It's got to be this year because there is every chance that he is going to need to make some more adjustments before coming back to start full time in 26. And so that's kind of the obvious one. To me, I'm also like, there are all these guys in the majors. There's Brandon Young. I know that you're a big Chase McDermott guy. Those are guys that if whether or not you deal Sagano and Eflin or just one of them, I still think that you need to change up your pitching staff. You could go, an idea that you threw out, Daniel, was going with like maybe some lefty righty combos, maybe when Bradish gets back, pairing him with a guy like Povich or pairing him with a guy, who was the other name that you mentioned to pair him with?
Rogers, too, like a soft
Rogers.
tossing lefty with some decent velocity from a righty.
And do that to get more guys more reps. I mean, I know I know that you don't no one's trying to lose games ever, but I do think that the win-loss record at the end of the year, if it's 5 games below 500 or 9 games below 500, it really that does not make a big difference. It doesn't matter. And so I think trying out different guys and giving some different guys, the chance to come up. And it applies to the pitchers too. We've seen less major pitcher debuts in the last few years because the Orioles haven't invested in young pitching. But right now, guys like McDermott and Young are in a position to be competing for a rotation spot with a huge expectations on the Orioles in 26. And like I mentioned with the batters, that's a lot of pressure to be coming into the majors is enough pressure alone. Coming into a situation that is loaded with expectations is even harder. And so getting them those developmental reps this year, letting them figure out what they need to work on and having the whole offseason to do it instead of having to figure out in the middle of the season next year. I think so many of those things are so crucial for getting guys up. And it's you have to be honest with yourself about the future of a guy like Dean Kramer on this team in terms of making your roster decisions. Now, I really don't know if there's any team that would want to go out and trade for Kramer. I know he has multiple years of control left, but he does not profile as a long-term starter for a contending team. He just has never performed that way. He has been pretty dependable as an inning eater over the last 3 years, and that's all well and good. But if he is taking starts from guys that you want to develop, you got to consider moving on from him via trade. Obviously, I don't think you'd want to just cut him or get rid of him, but I think that's why you have to be willing to trade a guy who, coming into this year, I don't think you'd be thinking about trying to sell.
Yeah, I think, we're talking about these concrete goals, and while the win-loss record at this point feels a little irrelevant, I do think offensively, I want to see this team finish the year among, maybe the upper half or the top 10 of Major League Baseball in like team OPS and runs scored. Like now that this team is healthy, we should be scoring runs like a good team. But since this pitching is just such a complete mess, and it's only going to get messier after the trade deadline when we ship off anyone who's not going to be here in 2026, I mean, we just need to exhaust every option that we have. And just because I think once we trade potentially guys like Gregory Sotos or Anthony Dominguez who are on expiring contracts, that's going to open up more bullpen roles too. And so I wouldn't be surprised, or at least I would think, we might want to bring in some of these starters to fill those bullpen vacancies. And then we kind of go with 4 inning auditions for a lot of guys, and maybe we do two of them in the same game and just kind of see what happens, right? Because we don't have anybody on the roster for next year that's a pitcher that's healthy right now. I mean, look, I don't know what's happening with Grayson Rodriguez. Hopefully he's pitching next year. And Kyle Bradish is hopefully going to get back to his old self next year. But besides those two, healthy on this roster, we don't have anyone that we can look to and say they should definitely be on the team next year in the starting rotation. So let's find out who should be on the team next year, or if any of them should be on the team next year, to be frank. Have we just failed as a whole in talent evaluation on trying to get this bargain bin pitching that we tried initially?
Yeah, I mean we have ranted about the pitching roster construction all all year, dating back to the offseason. And that's why you have to try and and I don't think anything we're advocating for is super radical, but yeah, I think you have Bradish coming back off an injury. That's an obvious opportunity to pair someone with him to limit his exposure as he ramps up and get someone else some exposure. Wells, I don't know what the situation is. Grayson, at this point, I think there's merit to just shutting him down for the year. But I think if he comes back, I have no reason to want to give him a major workload if he comes back. And if you call up some of these starters from AAA who can be long relievers or second starters or whatever the term is, in partnership with some of the guys coming off injuries, there's your opportunity to, one, help the guys coming off injuries get comfortable on the mound again and all that stuff, and do the same thing for the guys who are younger. It could put you in some weird situations with your bullpen later in the season. Roster expansion will obviously help that. And again, I think there is merit in letting some of these guys struggle. The pitchers aren't in the same situation as the hitters where the majors is the first time they've ever really struggled on the field. Most of these pitchers have, worked their way up through the minors through a lot of ups and downs, given that not a lot of them were premium draft picks. But I think it's still important for them to get the chance to work through that in the major league level in a lower pressure situation. In terms of the lineup, again, I like seeing Holiday bat early. Rutschman, can stay in the lower tier of the lineup until he proves that he's worth more. I'm not a big believer that lineup construction is the biggest deal in the world, but I do think that again, it's an opportunity to tinker with things and see if you can um, build your lineups with some intentionality towards stability next year. Because I know this was an issue for the team to start the year with how many different lineups Hyde was employing, different positions, tinkering the 1 through 9 spots. And the players talked about that. And they talked about how Mansolino's offered a little bit more stability in the lineup since he's come aboard and hasn't been afraid to drop guys who aren't hitting down lower in the lineup. And so I think the other thing to try and do the rest of the year is be intentional. And I think that applies across everything is be very intentional with what you're doing with an eye on the future. But even with things as small as the daily lineup, especially once you've clarified the roster picture after the trade deadline, make it so that you can come into the 26 season with a pretty concrete idea of what you want your day-to-day lineup's going to be so that you don't have the same hiccups that you had early this year.
Absolutely. I mean, look, it's very much a developmental year for the pitching because we, again, like we've said many times, organizationally, ignored draft prospects who would be pitching in the majors at this point. And for the hitting, it's time to it's time to take off. Everyone's let's see the hitting lift off, Mike Elias, right? Like it's time. We got everyone healthy pretty much, and even though Mountcastle's out, we got our new guy Mayo in, and maybe even we get a Sam Basayo call up later in the year. Let's see the offense start hitting better because they have been far below expectations as a team. And so it's going to certainly be a big trade deadline for Mike Elias, given the fact that a lot of people are calling for his head already.
Yeah, I think, the expectations for the pitching, it's kind of that meme, like our expectations were low, but like somehow you fell below them. I'm not sure this pitching is even below what my expectations were coming into the year, especially considering the injuries. I'm not sure I expected the pitching to be much better than it's been based on the roster construction, but the hitting certainly, they're just not meeting expectations. And so it makes it a very clear dynamic for the rest of the year where, like you said, they have to be the hitters they're supposed to be, the hitters they were drafted to be in almost every case. Whereas the pitching, it's a little bit more experimental. You're trying to figure things out. You're trying to keep guys healthy and figure out what their health status is the rest of the season. And I think that's where there's less intense expectations and more of a desire to experiment and kind of get more information out of what you're dealing with on your pitching staff that you can take into the offseason. That is, like you mentioned from Michael Elias, he's on the hot seat now. Imagine the offseason when he's having to figure out how to retool this pitching staff. For the third, fourth year in a row and just can't find the stability on the mound. First, though, will come the trade deadline. And I think, in the past, the trade deadline's been kind of depressing for the Orioles because they've either been selling all their best guys or they've been unwilling to part with the prospects that would get them the guys that they really need, like last year. Like Kerstad is an example last year to go out and get a real starter, a real top line starter. He could have been in a package for that. So this is a big, big trade deadline for Mike Elias, both in terms of sending a message about his assessment of the team, but also our ability to assess him and his ability to effectively steer this team. I'm really excited. We're going to bring a trade deadline episode to you here in the next few weeks. Daniel has been working on a number of proposed trades because there are some beloved guys like Ryan O'Hearn, Cedric Mullins, who could be headed out of Baltimore at the trade deadline. There are some pitchers who are relatively new to the team, like Zach Eflin and Tomoyuki Sugano, who could be headed out before they even really get a chance to establish themselves as Orioles in the long term. It is a big deadline, and I think that it's not the deadline itself won't make or break Elias's job, but I think it will tell us a lot about Elias's plans for the offseason and what he anticipates doing. Daniel, any final thoughts?
Yeah, well, with what Nikhil is referencing about the trade deadline, I posted a piece on justbaseball.com. It's already up. You can go and check it out. It's called "What Would an Orioles Sell-Off Look Like?" I break down all the options of guys who could be on the move, and there's some trade proposals in there as well that are analyzed too. That's already up. So if you're listening, you can go and check it out on justbaseball.com, and we're going to talk about that and also get into a little more depth from a team perspective as well on a coming pod. I just think I want to see the bats take off. It is my final assessment. The pitching and the team win-loss record are I don't even really care that much anymore. I just want to see this team putting up more crooked numbers than they have thus far.
Yeah, I need proof of concept that this lineup is going to be the one that can take the Orioles to the promised land, because it's practically impossible to figure out the pitching this year, but it might be possible to figure out the hitting, and I think that's a reasonable goal. Thank you so much for those of you who listen. Daniel, thank you for joining me, and we're excited to bring the trade deadline episode to you here soon. Going to be able to talk about buying and selling, which is a little unusual for the Orioles. They've been buyers last few years and sellers before that. So an interesting balance for Mike Elias to strike in what could be his last trade deadline as general manager if he does not effectively turn this team around. So thanks so much for joining today, and as always, thank you to Daniel for your excellent insight, and we hope to have you next time.
1, 2.